On a lighter note, one of the issues we dealt with in the Georgia Strait this week was the revival of Gastown. And that's the oldest section of Vancouver. Vancouver was actually created. The Hastings Mill was one of the first operations in Vancouver. And then a saloon was opened in Gastown by a guy named Jack Dayton in 1867. And he was known as Gassy Jack. So that's why the neighborhood that still exists today is known as Gastown. And in a few minutes, Michelle De Silva will be by, and she will discuss the restaurants in Gastown, because that is one of the big attractions. And it's always been a popular destination for tourists. But in the 1960s, there was talk of a freeway being built into Vancouver. And that's Highway 1, the Trans-Canada Highway. As you come in through Burnaby, they were going to take it right into downtown Vancouver, through Chinatown, and through Gastown. Well, there was a huge public uproar, particularly in Chinatown, that they said, we don't want to see the history of Vancouver demolished to make way for a freeway. And that caused changes at the electoral level. A new mayor was elected named Art Phillips. And eventually, the governments backed down and said, okay, we won't build a freeway into Vancouver. So that's why you only have the exit at First Avenue and Hastings Street, but the freeway doesn't go all the way into Vancouver. Well, what happened then was the provincial government in 1971 passed legislation that designated Chinatown and Gastown as provincial heritage districts. And that meant that the building owners were not allowed to tear down the buildings. But the problem was they had to bring the buildings up to modern earthquake codes and building codes. And these are very old structures. So they weren't allowed to tear them down, they weren't given any compensation, and they couldn't lease out their space, particularly in Gastown, because it was decided that the buildings were too dangerous. So these Gastown building owners, particularly in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and even into the 1990s, they couldn't get tenants, and the vacancy rate increased. And a lot of the poorer residents of Vancouver and the downtown east side started moving into Gastown. And then what happened was there was a little more drug use. The neighborhood went into decline. The tourism industry wasn't happy about that. And so a planner named Nathan Edelson became the senior planner for Gastown, Chinatown, Strathcona, and the downtown east side in 1994. And he and some of the people at City Hall decided they wanted to deal with this. And how could you do that? And how could you bring these neighborhoods together? So I've written an article in the Georgia Strait describing that history, which I found very interesting because from a planning perspective, you had to deal with many different interests. The people in the downtown east side, they wanted their housing protected. And that was their primary concern, but they also wanted health facilities. Many of the poor residents of the neighborhood didn't even have access to a doctor in the 1990s. So that was issue one. Issue two was the people of Gastown, that they wanted to be able to make some money out of their buildings because they couldn't tear them down, but they were losing a lot of money. And the tourism industry wanted to revive Gastown as a big attraction for Vancouver. In Chinatown, the concern was heritage. They didn't want to sell their buildings, but some of the societies were wondering, how can we fix them up? And then there were also issues in Strathcona about community safety. So during this period, you also had the mayor of the day, Philip Owen, gathering politicians from the provincial, federal, and municipal scene, and he'd hold this Vancouver caucus. Mayors have never held this since then, but Philip Owen would do this. He'd gather all the Vancouver politicians together, and one of them is a medical doctor, Dr. Hetty Fry, from a Liberal MP from Vancouver Centre. And she said the problems with addiction were really an issue, a health problem, as much as a criminal justice problem, and that it needed to be tackled in a health way. And she had some influence. The Attorney General of the day was Ujjal Dosanjh, and he was very progressive and wanted to deal with the issues. And then Philip Owen was the mayor, and the municipal affairs minister was Jenny Kwan. So they all worked together on a plan to increase health facilities in the downtown east side. So we had a contact center at the Roosevelt Hotel. We had a couple of medical clinics. And then they also created a supervised injection site where the drug users could go to shoot their drugs. And the police said this was fine, and that ended the open drug market and helped clean up Chinatown. So the Gastown property owners, they needed to be dealt with. So the city came up with something called a heritage density program where they could sell the air rights. So they sell the density above the building to other developers. They take the money and use it to fix up their buildings. And according to Leonor Sally of the Gastown Business Improvement Association, that was a major measure in terms of fixing up Gastown and turning it into a very appealing neighborhood. What's happened since then is we've had the high-tech industry has been flocking to Gastown, the digital media. You've got a thriving fashion scene in Gastown and lots of restaurants. But on the housing side, in the downtown east side, their issues haven't been dealt with satisfactorily. And part of the reason is in the 1990s you had federal and provincial governments that were quite interested in building housing, but that has changed. The Conservative government is not in the housing business at all in terms of building housing. Rich Coleman, who's the housing minister provincially, has gathered a bunch of sites and has kind of kick-started the provincial program after several years to at least secure sites for nonprofit housing. But the homeless problem is increasing and gentrification is increasing in the downtown east side, and that's causing a lot of disturbances. One of the big issues that actually revived the Gastown neighborhood too was the Woodwards development, which is a massive development. It was a major shopping destination that had been shut down for years. Well, then now there's 200 units of social housing at Woodwards. There's a London Drugs. SFU has a downtown campus at Woodwards, and that's breathed new life into the area. So the history of Gastown is an indication, I think, in a way, of the revival of the whole downtown of Vancouver. And downtown Vancouver is a very appealing and was ahead of many other cities in terms of reviving the downtown. And tonight, actually, there's a live concert in Gastown, the Making Music in Vancouver series. So there's probably going to be, there may be 30 or 40,000 people in the streets in Gastown. So it's a sign that Gastown is back.